Sometimes the most powerful statements are made in absolute silence. No press conference, no official announcement, just a carefully sealed document hidden behind dusty books in a forgotten corner of Windsor Castle, waiting to detonate like a delayed explosion through the carefully maintained facade of royal unity. What that document revealed would expose fault lines in the family that nobody had seen coming, turning a quiet young woman who'd spent her entire life avoiding attention into the center of a storm that threatened to tear apart relationships that had taken decades to carefully construct. The discovery happened on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in early autumn, months after Queen Elizabeth II had been laid to rest. A maintenance worker, someone who'd spent nearly 3 decades in palace service without ever making headlines or causing problems, was assigned to reorganize one of Windsor Castle's lesser-used libraries. These weren't the grand public spaces tourists photographed. These were working rooms, storage areas where books accumulated faster than anyone bothered to catalog them, places that could go years between serious attention. Moving a heavy oak bookshelf away from the wall to check for water damage, the worker noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Behind volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched since before the internet existed, tucked into a deliberately carved gap in the wall itself, sat a leather portfolio, not carelessly dropped or accidentally left behind. This had been placed with intention, hidden with purpose. The portfolio bore markings that made the worker's hands shake slightly, the royal insignia pressed into leather that had aged but remained intact, and across the wax seal that held it closed, a signature that was unmistakable to anyone who'd worked in royal service. This had come directly from Queen Elizabeth herself. Palace protocol was absolutely clear about discoveries like this. Don't open it, don't discuss it, report it immediately to senior household staff, and let people paid far more than you decide what happens next. Within an hour, 3 of the Queen's most trusted former advisors had been quietly summoned. They arrived separately, each entering through different doors, each sworn to absolute secrecy before being shown what had been found. The precautions weren't paranoia, they were necessity, because once that seal was broken and the contents revealed, there would be no containing what came next. The advisors broke the seal in a room with no windows, no recording devices, nothing that could leak what they were about to discover. The portfolio opened to reveal documents in the Queen's own handwriting, that distinctive script that had signed legislation and condolence letters and Christmas cards for 7 decades. But this wasn't formal correspondence. This was personal, detailed, and absolutely clear in its intentions. Queen Elizabeth had created a directive regarding a property, not Balmoral, where she'd spent her final days, not Sandringham, her Norfolk retreat that had been in the family for generations. This was something else entirely, something none of them had known existed. The property, referred to only by coordinates and a trust account number that meant nothing without context, was to be transferred in its entirety to Lady Louise Windsor, not shared with other grandchildren, not divided according to some carefully calculated formula designed to avoid hurt feelings. Just Louise, complete ownership, immediate transfer upon the Queen's death. The document was dated 3 years earlier, time-stamped, and witnessed by 2 individuals whose identities had been redacted but whose signatures carried legal weight that made the directive unassailable in any court. The room fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with shock. These were people who thought they knew every detail of Queen Elizabeth's affairs. They'd spent careers managing her estates, her investments, her public image, and yet she'd maintained a secret significant enough to hide behind library walls, important enough to document with such care, and controversial enough that she'd chosen concealment over transparency even with her most trusted staff. One of the advisors finally spoke, asking the obvious question, what property? Because if this was significant enough to warrant such elaborate secrecy, it wasn't some minor cottage or hunting lodge, this was something that mattered. The search through trust documents and property records took hours. The Queen had been extraordinarily careful in how she'd structured ownership, using layers of legal entities and privacy protections that made direct connection to the Crown nearly impossible to trace. But eventually, persistence revealed the truth. And when it did, the implications hit like a physical force. The property was a substantial estate in one of Scotland's most remote regions, over 200 acres of highland terrain, largely inaccessible except by private road, surrounded by land that provided natural barriers to casual approach. The main house contained more than 40 rooms, built from local stone in a style that suggested it had been there for generations but maintained with obvious care and significant expense. But the property's value had nothing to do with real estate. What made this place priceless was what Queen Elizabeth had stored inside across 7 decades of reign. This was her private archive, her genuine sanctuary. The place she'd gone when being queen became too heavy a burden to carry publicly, and she'd hidden its very existence from almost everyone, including her own son who now wore the crown. The documents made clear this wasn't oversight or accident. Queen Elizabeth had deliberately concealed this property and her intentions for it, protecting both from exactly the kind of scrutiny and conflict that was now inevitable. Because the choice to give everything to Lady Louise, bypassing senior royals and creating such obvious preference, was going to cause an explosion that would make previous family conflicts look like minor disagreements. King Charles was informed within 24 hours. His reaction, according to those present, was complicated. Surprise that his mother had maintained such a significant secret, confusion about why she'd chosen Louise over what seemed like more obvious candidates, and underneath everything else, a growing awareness that this was going to create massive problems with Camilla's family, who had spent years positioning themselves as integral to the monarchy's future and would view this exclusion as devastating rejection. The first question everyone kept asking was why Lady Louise? She was 20th in line to the throne. She'd deliberately chosen not to use the princess title she could have claimed. She'd spent her entire life being almost invisible compared to other young royals, avoiding social media attention, staying out of tabloid stories, living a life so quiet it sometimes seemed like she was trying to disappear entirely. Why would Queen Elizabeth, who'd spent 70 years making calculated decisions about symbols and succession, choose this particular granddaughter for such an extraordinary inheritance? The answer, they would discover, lay in a relationship that had developed almost entirely out of public view. While cameras followed William and Harry, while commentators analyzed every detail of George and Charlotte's upbringing, Louise had been building something with her grandmother that nobody had noticed. Not because they were hiding it, but because neither of them sought attention for it. They'd spent time together not for photo opportunities or official functions, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company in ways that didn't require performance or pretense. But before anyone could fully process what this inheritance meant, news of the discovery began leaking through palace channels. Staff members sworn to secrecy told spouses. Advisors mentioned it to colleagues they trusted. And within 48 hours, Camilla's family had heard enough to understand that something significant had happened, something that affected them personally and not in ways they were going to accept quietly. The Parker Bowles clan had spent decades working their way from social pariahs to accepted members of the royal circle. Tom Parker Bowles had built a successful career while carefully maintaining connections to his stepfather's world. Laura Lopes had raised her children with one foot in aristocratic society and another in the royal family's extended network. They'd all endured the years when Camilla was Britain's most hated woman, standing by her through public contempt that would have broken weaker families. And they'd celebrated when she finally became queen consort, believing they'd arrived at a place where their connection to the crown was secure. Then a hidden document revealed that Queen Elizabeth, in her most private and personal decision about her own property, had looked at the entire extended family and decided that none of them merited inclusion. Not a small bequest, not a symbolic gesture. Complete exclusion. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had been spelled out in formal language. Camilla's family, despite decades of effort and years of official acceptance, were not considered truly family by the woman whose opinion mattered most. The initial response was rage. Phone calls between family members grew heated as they tried to understand how this had happened without anyone noticing. When had the Queen made this decision? Had Camilla known and not told them? Had Charles been complicit in keeping them in the dark? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found, and with each new detail that emerged about the property's significance, the sense of insult deepened. Because this wasn't just real estate. This was Queen Elizabeth's most private sanctuary, the place she'd kept hidden even from people who thought they knew her completely. And she'd chosen to give all of it, every room full of memories, and every document containing unfiltered history, to a 20-year-old who shared no blood with Camilla's children. The symbolism was devastating. In death, Queen Elizabeth had drawn a line that clearly delineated who was truly family and who was merely adjacent to it, tolerated but never fully embraced. Tom Parker Bowles was reportedly the first to suggest legal action. He consulted with attorneys who specialized in contested estates, looking for any angle that might challenge the inheritance. Could they argue diminished capacity? The Queen had been 96 when she died. Surely there was room to question whether she'd been fully competent when creating the directive years earlier. Could they claim the property should have been considered Crown estate rather than private holding, subject to different rules about inheritance? Was there any procedural irregularity, any technical flaw that might provide an opening? The lawyer's assessment was brutally clear. The document was airtight, dated years before the Queen's death, eliminating any argument about deathbed confusion, witnessed properly by individuals whose credibility couldn't be questioned. The property's status as private rather than Crown holding was established through decades of separate ownership and management. There were no procedural errors, no ambiguous language, no loopholes to exploit. Legally, the inheritance was unassailable, but more dangerous than the lack of legal options was the public relations catastrophe that even discussing a challenge would create. Britain was still in mourning for its longest-serving monarch. The idea that Camilla's family might contest Queen Elizabeth's final wishes hit the press before they'd made any formal decision about how to proceed. And the public reaction was immediate and savage. How dare they question the Queen's judgment? How dare they suggest she hadn't been competent to make her own decisions? The backlash was so intense and so unified that it killed any possibility of legal challenge before one could even be formally filed. Editorial pages across Britain's major newspapers ran scathing columns condemning what they called the grasping behavior of people who should have known better. The Guardian published a particularly devastating piece titled, "When is Enough Not Enough?" that detailed every privilege Camilla's family had already received through their connection to the Crown, from enhanced business opportunities to social access that would have been impossible otherwise. The Times ran a front-page analysis suggesting that any legal challenge would permanently damage not just Camilla's reputation, but King Charles's as well, potentially threatening the stability of his reign before it had barely begun. Social media erupted with a fury that surprised even experienced royal watchers. Hashtags defending Lady Louise and attacking the Parker Bowles family trended for days. Polling conducted in the immediate aftermath showed overwhelming opposition to any legal challenge, with 78% of respondents saying they would view such action as disrespectful to Queen Elizabeth's memory. More troubling for Camilla's family, 42% said their opinion of Queen Consort Camilla would be permanently damaged if she allowed her relatives to contest the inheritance. The person caught most painfully in the middle was King Charles himself. On one side stood his wife, hurt and angry on behalf of her children, who felt they'd been publicly rejected by his mother. On the other side stood his mother's clearly stated wishes, his own son Prince Edward defending his daughter's inheritance, and a British public that would not tolerate any perceived disrespect to Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Palace advisors held emergency meetings that stretched late into the night, trying to find some path forward that wouldn't destroy relationships or damage the monarchy's public standing beyond repair. The consensus among senior advisors was brutally clear. Any legal challenge must be stopped immediately and decisively. The cost to the monarchy's reputation would be catastrophic. Charles had spent his entire life waiting to be king, enduring decades of criticism and controversy. He couldn't afford to begin his reign by appearing to enable his wife's family in disrespecting his mother's final wishes. The message had to be clear and unambiguous. The inheritance stood. Lady Louise would receive everything Queen Elizabeth had intended her to have. And anyone who had a problem with that decision would need to make peace with their feelings privately, because public opposition was not an option. But stopping a legal challenge didn't eliminate the hurt or anger driving it. Camilla's family, particularly her children, felt they'd been given a clear message about their place in the royal hierarchy, and that message was devastating. They'd spent years building relationships, attending family gatherings, supporting Charles through difficult periods. Tom Parker Bowles had been careful never to exploit his royal connections in ways that might embarrass anyone. Laura Lopes had raised her children to understand their unique position without feeling entitled to special treatment. They'd played by rules that were never written down, trying to find the right balance between being present and not being presumptuous. And after all that careful navigation, Queen Elizabeth's final act had been to make crystal clear that they weren't truly family in the way that mattered most. Not to her. They could attend state functions, they could be photographed at family weddings, but when it came to her most private sanctuary, the place that contained her genuine self rather than her public persona, she'd looked at Camilla's children and decided they had no place there. That rejection, delivered from beyond the grave with the full weight of royal authority, cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. The situation grew more complicated when details about the estate itself began emerging through sources who'd worked there over the years. Staff members who'd signed confidentiality agreements decades ago felt released from those obligations by the Queen's death and the public controversy. What they revealed painted a picture of a property that was far more significant than anyone had initially realized. This wasn't just a vacation home or investment property. This was where Queen Elizabeth had maintained her genuine life, separate from the performance of monarchy. The estate, known to locals simply as Greystones, though that name appeared nowhere in official records, sat in one of the most remote regions of the Scottish Highlands. The nearest village was 8 miles away over a road that became impassable during heavy winter weather. The property itself was surrounded by land that provided natural barriers to casual approach, with the main access road gated and monitored in ways that suggested serious security concerns without being obvious about it. The main house had been built from local stone in the traditional Highland style, but it had been extensively modernized inside while maintaining its external appearance. Over 40 rooms spread across 3 floors, including a library that contained more than 10,000 volumes, many of them first editions or personally annotated by their famous readers. The collection reflected Queen Elizabeth's actual literary tastes, not the carefully curated image presented to the public. There were mysteries and thrillers, historical novels and biographies, even some romance fiction that would have surprised people who thought they knew her preferences. But it was what the house contained beyond books that made it historically priceless. Queen Elizabeth had used Greystones as her private archive, the repository for materials she wanted preserved but didn't want subjected to official scrutiny or public access. Personal letters from her father, King George VI, written during the abdication crisis and its aftermath, documenting his private anguish about inheriting a throne he'd never wanted and wasn't prepared to handle. Annotated diaries spanning her entire reign, recording not the sanitized official version of events, but her genuine reactions, frustrations, and private opinions about everything from political leaders to family dynamics. There were boxes of correspondence with Winston Churchill, with Margaret Thatcher, with every prime minister who'd served during her reign. Not the formal exchanges that would eventually be released to historians, but the frank private communications that revealed what she really thought about policies and personalities. There were photographs never released to public archives, capturing private family moments that showed vulnerability and genuine emotion rather than the carefully controlled images that defined her public persona. There was artwork that had been removed from royal collections for various reasons, some because they were too valuable to display with adequate security, others because they touched on subjects the family preferred not to highlight. Former staff members described rooms that functioned as time capsules, preserving exactly how Queen Elizabeth had left them during her final visit. Her reading glasses still sat on a side table next to a book marked with a leather bookmark. Her gardening boots stood by the back door, mud still caked on them from her last walk through the grounds. The kitchen retained notes in her handwriting about recipes she wanted to try and garden produce she wanted to preserve. These weren't artifacts carefully arranged for historical preservation. These were the remnants of a life genuinely lived by a woman who could finally be herself rather than performing monarchy. When Camilla learned just how personal and significant Greystones was, the rejection hit even harder. This wasn't just a valuable property Queen Elizabeth had decided to give away. This was her true home, the only place she'd apparently felt free to be completely authentic, and she'd chosen to share that space, that intimacy, that complete trust with Lady Louise, not with Charles, who would be king, not with William, who would follow him, not with any of the people who'd spent decades in her immediate orbit, just Louise, a granddaughter who ranked so low in succession that most royal watchers barely paid attention to her existence. The question that haunted everyone, that drove private conversations and fueled ongoing tension, was simply this: why Louise? What had this quiet young woman done to earn such extraordinary trust? What had she offered that more prominent family members apparently hadn't provided? The answer, those who'd witnessed the relationship understood, had everything to do with qualities that don't typically generate headlines or public attention, but matter enormously in genuine human connections. Lady Louise had been born with esotropia, a visual condition that required multiple surgeries during her childhood to correct. The medical issues that defined her early years had created in her a humility that privilege usually destroys. She'd spent formative years knowing she was different, dealing with visible evidence of imperfection that couldn't be hidden or explained away. While other young royals grew up being told they were special simply because of their bloodline, Louise had grown up understanding that being royal didn't protect you from struggle or guarantee that life would be easy. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, had made deliberate choices about how to raise their children that set them apart from other royal branches. They'd refused the titles of prince and princess that their children could have claimed. They'd insisted on normal education rather than exclusive royal schooling. They'd kept their children away from media attention as much as possible, declining photo opportunities that other royals eagerly pursued. Sophie, in particular, had been determined that her children would understand the value of work and privacy, that they wouldn't grow up feeling entitled to special treatment just because of their last name. Those choices had shaped Lady Louise into someone unusual within royal circles. She'd grown into a thoughtful young woman who read extensively, not to appear educated, but because she genuinely enjoyed books. She asked questions because she wanted to understand, not because she was performing interest. She listened more than she spoke, comfortable with silence in ways that were rare among people her age. And critically, she'd never once, not in 20 years of life, leaked private family information to the press or used her royal connection for social media attention. That discretion alone would have been remarkable, but it went deeper than just keeping secrets. Louise seemed genuinely uninterested in the fame and attention that most young people craved. She didn't post carefully curated photos on Instagram hoping for likes and followers. She didn't grant exclusive interviews to fashion magazines or allow herself to be photographed at trendy clubs and restaurants. She lived a life so quiet and private that sometimes it seemed like she was actively trying to disappear, to be invisible in ways that should have been impossible for someone born into one of the world's most famous families. Queen Elizabeth, who had spent 7 decades surrounded by people who wanted something from her, had found that lack of agenda profoundly refreshing. During summer visits to Balmoral, while other family members treated their stays as obligatory appearances to be endured, Louise would come alone and stay longer. She accompanied the Queen on morning walks without expecting conversation, comfortable with shared silence. She spent afternoons in the library genuinely absorbed in books rather than sneaking glances at her phone. She helped with small tasks without being asked, understanding instinctively that the Queen valued genuine assistance more than performative deference. The relationship deepened during what would prove to be Queen Elizabeth's final summer at Balmoral. Louise had arrived in early July, planning to stay a few weeks before returning to her studies. But the Queen asked her to extend the visit, then extended it again. By the time Louise finally left in late September, she'd spent nearly 3 months as her grandmother's primary companion, filling a role that went far beyond family obligation into genuine friendship. It was during that summer that Louise asked the question that would change everything. They were sorting through boxes of old photographs, organizing materials that had accumulated over decades, when Louise paused over an image of a much younger Queen Elizabeth with her father. She asked her grandmother what would happen to all these private papers and personal materials. Who would decide what historians could see? Who would protect the privacy of people who had confided in her? Who would ensure that history got the nuanced truth rather than simplified narratives designed to serve various agendas? The Queen didn't have a good answer. She'd always assumed these materials would be handled through official channels by archivists and royal historians working under strict protocols. But Louise's questions made her realize that official channels meant public channels eventually, that nothing left in institutional hands would remain truly private. Everything would eventually be released, analyzed, picked apart by academics and journalists who had no personal connection to the moments that had created those documents, no understanding of context that might require discretion rather than full disclosure. That realization troubled Queen Elizabeth deeply. She'd spent 70 years being extraordinarily careful about what she said publicly, knowing every word would be preserved and scrutinized. Her private papers were different. They contained her actual thoughts, her genuine reactions, her unfiltered opinions about events and people. She'd created them with the assumption they'd remain private, or at least be protected by people who understood that some truths serve history better when handled with discretion and respect for human dignity. Louise, without pushing or asking for anything, had made the Queen see that she needed a different solution. She needed someone who understood the historical value of preserving these materials, but who also understood the human need to protect privacy and dignity, someone who would resist pressure to monetize or sensationalize, who would say no to profitable book deals or documentary projects that would exploit private pain for public consumption, someone whose judgment she could trust completely because that person had proven over years that discretion wasn't performance, but character. Over the remaining weeks of that summer, Queen Elizabeth tested Louise in ways the young woman probably never fully recognized. She'd share stories about past controversies, watching to see if Louise would repeat them to other family members or let details slip in casual conversation. She didn't. She'd ask Louise's opinion on how certain sensitive materials should be handled, looking for signs of ambition or interest in using information for personal advantage. She found none. Most tellingly, she'd occasionally leave valuable items in Louise's care, and they always remained exactly where they'd been left, never moved or examined beyond what was necessary for proper handling. By September of that final summer at Balmoral, Queen Elizabeth had made her decision. She met privately with her solicitors and began creating a trust that would transfer ownership of the Scottish estate to Lady Louise Windsor upon her death. She structured it to bypass official royal channels, to remain hidden until after she was gone, and to be legally unassailable once revealed. The Queen knew this would cause conflict. She wasn't naive about family dynamics or the hurt feelings that would result, but she'd reached a point where protecting her legacy mattered more than avoiding family drama. The document she created included a personal letter to Louise explaining her reasoning. She acknowledged that Louise might face criticism and conflict because of this inheritance. She apologized in advance for the burden she was placing on her granddaughter. But she also expressed absolute confidence that Louise was the right choice, the only choice, because she represented qualities the Queen valued above all others: discretion, integrity, and genuine respect for history over headlines. When Louise left Balmoral that September, she knew about the estate and the Queen's plans. She'd been sworn to secrecy, told the transfer wouldn't happen for years, and urged to continue living her life exactly as she had been. The Queen didn't want Louise feeling burdened by expectation or changing her behavior based on future inheritance. She just wanted Louise to know she was trusted, valued, and seen as the keeper of memories that mattered more than crowns. The confrontation that finally brought everything into the open happened months after the document's discovery at Clarence House. The meeting between Prince Edward and Camilla was never supposed to occur. Both sides had been advised to let matters settle quietly, to avoid direct confrontation that could escalate into permanent family rupture. But emotions were running too high, and stakes felt too important for strategic patience. Camilla had requested the meeting, framing it as an attempt to understand and find common ground. Edward, as Louise's father, felt obligated to defend his daughter against what he saw as unfair attacks. The conversation, held in a small sitting room, was meant to be private and conciliatory. According to staff members within earshot, it became neither. Camilla began by expressing confusion and hurt. She outlined years of effort becoming an accepted family member, sacrifices made supporting Charles, and careful relationship building across generations. Then she pivoted to the accusation simmering beneath everything, that Edward and Sophie had deliberately cultivated Louise's relationship with the Queen for exactly this purpose, to secure an inheritance elevating their branch of the family. Edward's response was immediate and cold. He pointed out that Louise's relationship with her grandmother had developed naturally without orchestration or ulterior motive. Louise had never asked for anything, never positioned herself for advantage, and had been as surprised as everyone by the inheritance. He went further, suggesting that if Camilla's family felt excluded, perhaps they should examine why the Queen hadn't felt close enough to them to share this part of her life. The conversation deteriorated rapidly. Camilla allegedly referenced differences in royal hierarchy, noting that as Queen Consort, she outranked Edward's entire family. She suggested the inheritance undermined that structure and set dangerous precedent. Edward countered that rank had nothing to do with personal relationships, that the Queen's choice of who to trust with her private legacy was hers alone to make. The breaking point came when Camilla questioned whether the Queen had been fully aware of what she was doing. The suggestion that Elizabeth might have been manipulated or confused brought Edward to his feet. He reportedly told Camilla in unmistakable terms that questioning the Queen's mental capacity was not just offensive, but potentially catastrophic for the entire family. If she continued down that path, she would face opposition not just from him, but from other family members who would not tolerate such disrespect to the late monarch's memory. Sophie, Edward's wife, had been present but quiet through most of the exchange. She chose this moment to speak, and her comments shifted the dynamic entirely. She calmly pointed out that the real issue wasn't the inheritance itself, but what it revealed about relationships within the family. The Queen had chosen to share her most private sanctuary with someone she trusted completely. Rather than attacking Louise or questioning the Queen's decision, perhaps everyone should reflect on why those trust relationships had developed the way they did. The meeting ended without resolution. Camilla left first, visibly upset. Edward and Sophie remained, discussing damage control strategies to protect Louise from escalating family conflict. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through palace circles, with different versions emerging depending on which side's supporters were telling the story. What no one disputed was that the confrontation had made reconciliation much harder. Lines had been drawn, accusations made, trust damaged. In the months that followed, the royal family learned to exist with a fracture that couldn't be openly acknowledged but couldn't be ignored either. Public appearances continued with practiced professionalism. Christmas gatherings happened with carefully maintained civility. But beneath the surface, everyone understood that Queen Elizabeth's final act had exposed divisions that went far deeper than anyone had realized. Lady Louise herself remained largely silent through the entire controversy. She didn't grant interviews or issue statements. She didn't defend herself on social media or through carefully placed anonymous quotes to friendly journalists. She simply continued living her life with the same quiet dignity that had earned the Queen's trust in the first place. Those close to her said the inheritance had been both honor and burden, that she took seriously the responsibility of protecting her grandmother's legacy while struggling with the family conflict her mere existence seemed to provoke. The property itself remained largely inaccessible to everyone except Louise and a small staff sworn to continued confidentiality. Requests from family members to visit were politely declined through Louise's private secretary. Suggestions that certain materials might be shared or made available for authorized biographies were met with silence. Louise had apparently taken to heart the Queen's trust that she would protect this sanctuary not just physically, but from the kind of exploitation and publicity that would destroy what made it valuable. Some family members, particularly those who'd never felt particularly close to Queen Elizabeth, viewed Louise's guardianship of Greystones as appropriate and even admirable. Princess Anne, who'd spent her life understanding duty over personal preference, reportedly approved of her mother's choice. Prince William, who'd watched Louise handle the controversy with grace, privately expressed respect for how she'd managed an impossible situation. Even some of Charles's closer advisors admitted, in unguarded moments, that the Queen had probably chosen correctly, even if the choice had created difficulties. But for Camilla's family, acceptance came slowly, if at all. They continued feeling that Queen Elizabeth's final act had been deliberate rejection, a statement from beyond the grave that they would never truly belong, regardless of how long Charles remained king or how hard they worked to earn acceptance. That sense of exclusion poisoned relationships in subtle ways that formal apologies or private conversations couldn't entirely heal. The inheritance had become a symbol of something larger than property or possessions. It represented fundamental questions about who truly belonged in the royal family's inner circle, whether marriage could ever fully erase the boundaries of blood, and what it meant to be trusted with the authentic, rather than performed version of monarchy. Queen Elizabeth had spent 70 years being extraordinarily careful about maintaining those boundaries, about protecting the distinction between public service and private self. In choosing Lady Louise as the guardian of her most private sanctuary, she'd made a final statement about what she valued most: discretion over prominence, character over status, and the kind of trust that couldn't be earned through position, but only through years of proving you understood the difference between what should be shared and what should be protected. Whether that choice would ultimately serve the monarchy well or create divisions that weakened it remained to be seen. But one thing was absolutely certain. Lady Louise, thrust into this role by a grandmother who'd seen something in her that others had missed, now carried a responsibility that would define the rest of her life. She was the keeper not just of property, but of truth, the guardian not just of documents, but of a legacy. And how she handled that responsibility, whether she could maintain the discretion and integrity that had earned the Queen's trust while navigating family relationships poisoned by resentment and hurt, would determine whether Queen Elizabeth's final gamble had been wisdom or simply created problems that would outlast everyone involved. The months following the inheritance revelation transformed Lady Louise's life in ways she could never have anticipated. The young woman who had spent 20 years successfully avoiding public attention suddenly found herself at the center of intense scrutiny from media, family members, and a public fascinated by the idea that Queen Elizabeth had chosen this quiet granddaughter over more prominent relatives. Every appearance she made was analyzed for signs of how she was handling the pressure. Every choice about her education, her public engagements, even her clothing became subject to interpretation and commentary. Louise's response to this unwanted attention revealed exactly why Queen Elizabeth had trusted her with such an extraordinary responsibility. She didn't give interviews explaining her side of the story. She didn't leak carefully crafted anonymous quotes to sympathetic journalists. She didn't use social media to shape public perception or defend herself against criticism. She simply continued living her life with the same understated dignity that had characterized her entire existence, refusing to be drawn into public drama even when provocation came from directions that should have broken her composure. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, formed a protective barrier around their daughter that impressed even skeptical observers. They declined countless media requests for comment. They shut down attempts by distant relatives to use Louise's situation for their own publicity. They made it clear through both public statements and private conversations that anyone attempting to exploit or pressure Louise would face consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings. The message was unmistakable. Louise had been chosen by the Queen for specific reasons, and anyone who couldn't accept that decision with grace needed to examine their own relationship with the late monarch rather than attacking a young woman who'd done nothing except be worthy of extraordinary trust. The property itself, Greystones, remained closed to everyone except Louise and the small staff who maintained it. Requests to visit came from various family members with different levels of entitlement and urgency. Some were genuinely motivated by desire to understand what the Queen had preserved there. Others seemed driven more by curiosity or the belief that they deserved access based on their position within the royal hierarchy. All were politely but firmly declined through Louise's private secretary with language that left no room for negotiation or appeal. This absolute control over access infuriated some family members who felt their status entitled them to at least some acknowledgement. Camilla's children, particularly, struggled with the reality that this young cousin they'd barely paid attention to now controlled access to materials that might contain references to their mother, their own appearances in royal history, or private moments they'd assumed would remain family knowledge rather than one person's possession. The powerlessness they felt, being unable to even know what Louise had access to, much less control how she might use it, created resentment that festered despite surface civility at family gatherings. But Louise's handling of this impossible situation gradually won respect even from unlikely quarters. She didn't flaunt her position or use her unique access for personal advantage. She didn't hint at secrets she now possessed or suggest that documents in her care contained information others might want suppressed. She treated the inheritance with the same discretion the Queen had maintained during her lifetime, understanding that the value of Greystones lay not in its potential for revelation, but in its function as protected sanctuary for truth that served history better through careful guardianship than sensational disclosure. Approximately 18 months after the inheritance was revealed, something happened that shifted perceptions in significant ways. A respected royal historian working on a book about Queen Elizabeth's relationship with prime ministers during the Cold War reached out to Louise through formal channels, requesting access to any correspondence that might exist between the Queen and various political leaders during that period. The historian's request was professionally presented, backed by established credentials, and framed as genuine scholarly inquiry rather than tabloid exploitation. Louise's response surprised many observers. Rather than issuing a blanket refusal, she agreed to meet with the historian at Greystones. The meeting, conducted under strict confidentiality agreements and without any media presence, lasted several hours. During that time, Louise showed the historian selected materials from the Queen's archive, carefully chosen documents that provided historical insight without compromising personal privacy or revealing information that might cause diplomatic complications. She allowed the historian to take notes but not photographs, to quote with attribution but not to reproduce entire documents. The historian later described the experience in carefully worded public comments as extraordinary. Louise, he said, demonstrated an understanding of historical value combined with ethical responsibility that was rare in someone so young. She'd clearly spent considerable time since inheriting Greystones, reviewing materials in her care, understanding their significance, and developing frameworks for determining what could be shared and what required continued protection. Her judgments about what to reveal and what to withhold showed sophistication that suggested either remarkable natural instinct or considerable guidance from advisors who understood both history and discretion. That single interaction began shifting the narrative around Louise's inheritance. Instead of being portrayed as an undeserving recipient who'd somehow manipulated her way into the Queen's favor, she began being recognized as a thoughtful guardian who took seriously her responsibility to protect her grandmother's legacy while serving legitimate historical inquiry. Other scholars, hearing about the interaction, began submitting carefully crafted requests for access to specific materials. Louise developed a reputation for being difficult but not impossible, for maintaining high standards about purpose and use while being willing to facilitate genuine scholarship that respected the boundaries she'd established. This careful balancing act gradually diffused some of the family tension surrounding the inheritance. Even Charles, who'd initially been troubled by his mother's decision to bypass him entirely, began acknowledging privately that Louise seemed to be handling an extraordinarily complex responsibility with more grace than he might have managed at her age. William, whose own relationship with his grandmother had been close but complicated by his position as future king, expressed something like admiration for how Louise had refused to be intimidated by either family pressure or public attention. But not everyone came around to acceptance. Camilla's family, particularly her children, continued feeling that the inheritance represented rejection that went beyond property or documents. Tom Parker Bowles, in a rare, unguarded moment during a private dinner party, was overheard describing the situation as the Queen's final insult to people who'd spent decades proving their loyalty. Laura Lopes, while more circumspect in public, let close friends know that she viewed Louise's guardianship of materials that might contain references to her mother as fundamentally unfair, a situation where someone with no direct state-controlled narrative elements that affected people who actually lived through the events being preserved. These ongoing resentments created awkward dynamics at family gatherings that required attendance from both sides. Christmas at Sandringham, Easter at Windsor, various weddings and christenings throughout the year all became exercises in maintaining surface civility while navigating undercurrents of tension that everyone present understood, but nobody could openly acknowledge. Louise handled these situations by being present, but not prominent, participating in required activities while avoiding unnecessary interaction with family members whose discomfort with her inheritance remained obvious despite efforts at concealment. The public, watching this drama unfold through carefully managed leaks and occasional glimpses at official events, developed their own opinions about who was right and who was wrong. Polling conducted 2 years after the inheritance was revealed showed that 56% of Britons approved of Queen Elizabeth's decision to leave Greystones to Lady Louise, while only 23% thought it was unfair to other family members. The remaining respondents were either unsure or didn't care enough about internal royal family dynamics to form strong opinions. More tellingly, approval ratings for Lady Louise herself had risen significantly. Before the inheritance, most Britons couldn't have picked her out of a lineup or explained who she was beyond vague awareness she was somehow related to the royal family. After the inheritance and her handling of the subsequent controversy, she'd become one of the more popular members of the extended royal family, admired specifically for her refusal to court publicity or use her unique position for personal advantage. This public support created its own complications. Media interest in Louise intensified rather than fading as time passed. Photographers followed her hoping for photographs that might reveal something about her private life or her relationship with the controversial inheritance. Tabloids published speculative pieces about what documents existed at Greystones and what revelations they might contain. Some publications offered substantial sums for any staff member willing to break confidentiality and describe what they'd seen or heard while working at the estate. To date, not a single staff member has taken such offers. The loyalty Louise commands from people who work for her mirrors the loyalty her grandmother inspired, suggesting she's inherited not just property, but also the Queen's ability to inspire discretion through personal example rather than contractual obligation. Those who work at Greystones describe an employer who treats them with respect, who understands the significance of what they're protecting, and who never asks them to compromise their integrity for her convenience. As years passed and the initial shock of the inheritance faded into established reality, even some of Camilla's family began acknowledging, at least privately, that Queen Elizabeth had probably made a defensible choice, even if it wasn't the choice they would have preferred. Louise had proven herself to be exactly what the Queen apparently believed she was, someone whose discretion could be trusted absolutely, whose judgment about balancing historical transparency with personal privacy was sound, and whose commitment to protecting rather than exploiting her grandmother's legacy was genuine rather than performed. But underneath this gradual acceptance remained questions that would probably never be fully answered. Had Queen Elizabeth understood how much conflict her decision would create? Had she anticipated the hurt her choice would cause people who'd spent years trying to earn acceptance into the family? Had she considered alternative arrangements that might have accomplished her goals while causing less damage to relationships already strained by decades of complicated history? Those who knew the Queen best believed she'd understood all of this perfectly and made her choice anyway. Elizabeth had spent 70 years making decisions that balanced personal preference against institutional necessity, that weighed individual feelings against long-term consequences. She'd become extraordinarily skilled at seeing past immediate circumstances to understand how choices would echo across years and decades. The idea that she'd created this inheritance structure without fully understanding its implications seemed inconsistent with 7 decades of demonstrated judgment about complex family dynamics. The more likely explanation was that Queen Elizabeth had decided this particular decision was worth the conflict it would cause. That protecting her genuine legacy, ensuring the materials documenting her actual thoughts and feelings ended up with someone she trusted completely, mattered more than avoiding hurt feelings or maintaining surface harmony within a family that was already deeply fractured beneath its public facade. She'd spent a lifetime putting duty before personal preference. This had been one of the few times she'd done the opposite, prioritizing what she personally wanted over what might have been more diplomatically convenient. And she'd chosen Lady Louise not because Louise was perfect or because she represented some ideal vision of what a royal should be. She'd chosen Louise because over years of quiet observation, through long summers of genuine connection, she'd seen in this young woman qualities that were increasingly rare in any context and almost unheard of in people born into privilege: genuine humility, authentic discretion, and the ability to be trusted with power without being corrupted by it. Whether that choice would ultimately prove to be wise or simply create complications that outlasted everyone involved remained to be seen. The full contents of Greystones hadn't been revealed. The complete scope of materials Louise now controlled wasn't public knowledge. How she would handle that responsibility over the coming decades, whether her judgment would remain sound under pressures that would only intensify as she aged and as new generations of royals and historians sought access to materials in her care, couldn't be predicted with certainty. But what was already clear, what Queen Elizabeth had apparently understood before most others, was that Lady Louise possessed something that couldn't be taught or faked: the character to handle extraordinary responsibility without being defined or destroyed by it. She'd been thrust into a role that would have broken many people, made the target of resentment from family members who should have supported her, subjected to public scrutiny she'd spent her entire life carefully avoiding. And she'd handled all of it with grace that reflected credit not just on herself, but on the grandmother who'd seen her potential when others had looked right past her. The inheritance that shocked the royal family had accomplished something Queen Elizabeth probably intended all along. It had revealed character, exposed fault lines, and demonstrated that trust, Real trust, of the kind that survives death and protects legacy, couldn't be earned through position or performance, but only through years of proving you understood the difference between what should be shared and what should be guarded. Lady Louise had proven she understood that difference, and in doing so, she justified a choice that would echo through royal history long after everyone involved had followed Queen Elizabeth into memory. The transformation in how the inheritance was perceived publicly reached a turning point nearly 3 years after the initial revelation. A major documentary series about Queen Elizabeth's reign, produced by a respected filmmaker with unprecedented cooperation from various royal sources, included a segment about the private estate and Louise's role as its guardian. The producers had approached Louise requesting an interview, knowing the likelihood of acceptance was slim, but recognizing that even a refusal would need to be handled diplomatically given the project's high profile and royal family cooperation. To everyone's surprise, Louise agreed to participate, though under conditions that reflected her continued commitment to privacy and protection. She would not be filmed inside Greystones itself. She would not discuss specific documents or reveal details about particular materials in her care, but she would speak generally about her understanding of the responsibility she'd inherited and her approach to balancing historical preservation with privacy protection. The interview would be limited to 30 minutes, conducted at a neutral location, and subject to her approval before broadcast. What emerged from that carefully controlled conversation shifted public perception in ways that even Louise's supporters hadn't anticipated. Speaking with quiet confidence that came from 3 years of navigating impossible situations, Louise articulated a vision of guardianship that resonated far beyond royal family dynamics. She described her role not as ownership, but as stewardship, explaining that she saw herself as temporarily responsible for materials that belonged ultimately to history, but required protection during the lifetimes of people who might be hurt by premature disclosure. She spoke about her grandmother with obvious affection, but also clear-eyed understanding of the burden Queen Elizabeth had carried. The expectation that she should be always on, always performing, never fully herself except in spaces protected from public view. Louise described Greystones as her grandmother's only refuge from that relentless performance and suggested that respecting the Queen's need for one genuinely private space was the least she could do to honor a lifetime of public service. Most powerfully, Louise addressed the family controversy directly in a way she'd carefully avoided until that moment. She acknowledged that some relatives had been hurt by the inheritance, that she understood why they might feel excluded or rejected, but she also pointed out, gently but firmly, that her grandmother's decision to entrust her with this responsibility wasn't a statement about anyone else's worth or value. It was simply a choice about who Queen Elizabeth believed would handle specific materials in ways that aligned with her own values about discretion and historical integrity. The interview was broadcast as part of a documentary that reached millions of viewers worldwide. Reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Editorial pages that had previously questioned whether someone so young should control such significant historical materials praised Louise's maturity and thoughtfulness. Royal commentators who'd spent years criticizing various family members found themselves with little to criticize in how Louise had handled an inheritance she'd never sought and a responsibility that would define the rest of her life. Even some of Camilla's family, watching the interview, found themselves grudgingly impressed despite their continued hurt feelings. Louise had managed to defend her position and her grandmother's choice without attacking anyone, without suggesting that those who felt excluded were somehow deficient or unworthy. She'd simply stated her understanding of what the Queen had wanted and her commitment to honoring those wishes, regardless of personal cost. That interview marked a subtle but significant shift in the family dynamics surrounding the inheritance. At the next major royal gathering, Charles made a point of seeking out Louise for private conversation, something he'd avoided doing in the 3 years since the inheritance was revealed. According to sources close to both, he told her directly that he'd watched the documentary and been moved by how she'd spoken about his mother. He acknowledged that he hadn't initially understood his mother's reasoning, but had come to see it more clearly over time. While he couldn't speak for how everyone in the family felt, he wanted Louise to know that he supported her guardianship and appreciated how she'd handled an extraordinarily difficult situation. That conversation, though brief and relatively private, signaled something important to others in the family. If Charles, as king, could make peace with the inheritance and Louise's role, then continued public resentment or hostility became harder to justify. It didn't mean everyone suddenly embraced the situation with enthusiasm. Camilla's children remained hurt, and probably always would. But it created space for movement toward acceptance, for acknowledgement that fighting Queen Elizabeth's clearly stated wishes accomplished nothing except making everyone involved look petty and grasping. Louise's own life continued evolving around the inheritance without being entirely consumed by it. She completed her university education, though her choice of major history with focus on archival preservation was widely interpreted as preparation for her unique responsibility. She took on a small number of official royal engagements, carefully selected to align with causes she genuinely cared about rather than obligations accepted purely for appearance. She maintained her reputation for discretion, never using her unique position for social advancement or personal publicity. Perhaps most significantly, she began quietly mentoring younger members of the extended royal family, particularly those like herself who would never be senior working royals but needed to find meaningful roles within the family structure. Her advice to them, according to several who spoke about it years later, consistently emphasized the same principles she'd absorbed from her grandmother, that privilege came with responsibility, that public attention should be avoided rather than courted, and that the most valuable contributions often happened away from cameras and headlines. By the time 5 years had passed since the inheritance was revealed, it had become simply an accepted part of royal family structure. Louise was the guardian of Queen Elizabeth's private estate and the keeper of her most personal legacy. That reality, which had once seemed so shocking and controversial, had been normalized through time, through Louise's consistent handling of the responsibility, and through gradual recognition that Queen Elizabeth's judgment had been sound even when it caused pain to people who deserved consideration and respect. The long-term implications of the inheritance would continue unfolding for decades. As Louise aged and eventually needed to think about her own succession planning, questions would arise about who should inherit Greystones after her. Would it pass to her own children if she had them? Would it return to the direct line of succession? Would the materials it contained eventually be donated to official archives or remain under private guardianship indefinitely? These questions had no immediate answers, but they would need to be addressed eventually. Similarly, as time passed and people mentioned in Queen Elizabeth's private papers and diaries died, the calculus about what could be shared would shift. Materials that required protection during subjects' lifetimes might become appropriate for controlled historical access after their deaths. Louise would need to develop frameworks for making those judgments, ideally in consultation with historians, ethicists, and family members who had legitimate interests in how materials mentioning them or their parents would eventually be handled. These future complications didn't diminish what Louise had already accomplished. She'd taken an inheritance that shocked the royal family and handled it with remarkable grace under extraordinary pressure. She'd protected her grandmother's legacy while earning respect from people who'd initially questioned whether she deserved such responsibility. She'd demonstrated that Queen Elizabeth's final judgment about character and trustworthiness had been accurate, that the quiet granddaughter nobody paid much attention to possessed exactly the qualities needed to guard materials that would fascinate historians and gossip writers for generations. The broader lesson of the inheritance, the one that extended beyond royal family dynamics to touch on universal human experiences, was about the nature of trust and legacy. Queen Elizabeth had spent 7 decades being advised by experts, guided by protocol, and constrained by public expectations. But when it came to the most personal decision about her most private possessions, she'd ignored conventional wisdom about hierarchy and succession. She'd chosen based on character she'd observed directly, on discretion she'd tested repeatedly, on judgment she'd come to trust completely. That choice had caused pain to people who felt they'd earned different consideration. It had created conflict that would probably never be completely resolved. But it had also ensured that materials documenting Queen Elizabeth's genuine self, her actual thoughts and private reactions to events that shaped modern history, would be protected by someone whose loyalty was to truth and historical integrity rather than personal advantage or family politics. Whether future generations would view that choice as wise or simply complicated depended partly on what happened next, on how Louise continued handling the responsibility as she matured and as circumstances evolved in ways nobody could fully predict. But the foundation she'd established during the difficult early years, the reputation she'd built for thoughtful guardianship and ethical decision-making, suggested that Queen Elizabeth's gamble on her quiet granddaughter would likely be vindicated by time, even if it remained controversial to some who'd lived through its initial revelation. Lady Louise Windsor had inherited more than property or documents. She'd inherited a test of character that would define her entire life, and in the years since that inheritance shocked the royal family, she'd demonstrated exactly why Queen Elizabeth had seen something in her that others had missed. She possessed the rare combination of humility and strength, discretion and judgment that made her worthy of extraordinary trust, even when that trust came with extraordinary burden. The hidden estate Queen Elizabeth left to Lady Louise had revealed truths about the royal family that went far beyond property values or historical documents. It had exposed who truly valued discretion over publicity, who could be trusted with power without being corrupted by it, and who understood that some legacies served history better through protection than revelation. Queen Elizabeth had spent a lifetime making difficult choices about duty and family. Her final choice about her most private sanctuary proved to be among her most controversial, but it also proved to be exactly what she'd intended. A clear statement about values that mattered more than titles, about character that couldn't be inherited along with crowns, and about trust that had to be earned rather than assumed. And as Lady Louise continued living her life with the same quiet dignity that had earned that trust in the first place, she provided living proof that Queen Elizabeth's judgment, formed across decades of careful observation, had been absolutely correct even when it caused pain to people who deserved compassion and consideration. The inheritance that shocked the royal family had ultimately revealed something essential about monarchy, legacy, and the rare kind of character that could handle both without losing sight of what actually mattered. In the end, perhaps that was exactly what Queen Elizabeth had intended all along, not just to protect her private papers, but to demonstrate one final time that wisdom about character and trustworthiness came from careful observation over years rather than assumptions based on position or proximity. She'd made her choice. She'd hidden it carefully until after her death to protect Louise from pressure and interference. And she'd been proven right in ways that would echo through royal history long after everyone involved had followed her into the quiet of their own final legacies. The secret estate was no longer secret. The shocking inheritance was no longer shocking. What remained was exactly what Queen Elizabeth had apparently hoped for. A young woman she'd trusted completely, proving worthy of that trust, protecting a legacy that mattered, and demonstrating that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important truths. Lady Louise Windsor had inherited more than an estate. She'd inherited a responsibility that would define her life, and she was handling it exactly as her grandmother had known she would, with grace, discretion, and absolute commitment to honoring trust that extended beyond death into the careful preservation of truth that served history better through protection than premature revelation. That was Queen Elizabeth's final gift to both her granddaughter and to history itself. And it was working exactly as intended, despite the shock, despite the controversy, despite everything that made it difficult. Because some legacies require guardians who understand that being trusted with truth is more important than any title, any position, or any expectation about how inheritance should work. Lady Louise had proven herself to be exactly that kind of guardian, and in doing so, she justified every element of the choice that shocked the royal family and changed her life forever.